Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of the Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this segment, I'm going to show you how to sew together the triangle in a square blocks. The key is matching up the triangles in a few key places for great results every time. But first, let's talk for a minute about sewing setup. Because I piece and quilt all of my own quilts, I'm always thinking about how I'm sewing is going to affect my machine quilting later on. I'm using Wallflowers 50 weight cotton thread in a fun color because my fabrics are so colorful and bright. I'm also using up leftover bobbins from previous projects. These are all from my piece and quilt collection of Wallflowers thread. I've lowered my stitch length to 2.0. Sewing with a shorter stitch length will enable me to press my seams open without worrying about the seams coming open at the ends. I will stop sewing with the needle in the down position, and I engage the hover feature on my Bernina so that I don't have to raise the presser foot each time I stop sewing. I'm using a 1/4 inch patchwork foot that fits my sewing machine. My pieces are all stacked right next to my machine so that they'll be easy to assemble. I always start by sewing with a little scrap of fabric called a leader to catch my starting threads. Now that you've seen how I set up my sewing machine and my workspace, it's time to sew. Flip the side triangle on top of the center triangle. If it has a pointy end, ensure that it's sticking out about a 1/4 inch beyond the blunted top of the center triangle. Use your fingers to smooth everything in place. The blunted tip of the side triangle should stop a 1/4 inch above the pointy end of the center triangle. I'm using a stiletto to guide my pieces into place under the machine. Stitch an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Try not to wobble while you sew. Stitch all the way to the end of the piece and don't veer off at the end. Continue stitching the next set of units without clipping threads in between. This is called chain piecing. Sew all of the units in the same way. Here's a close-up of what it should look like if you cut with a rotary cutter and Tri-Rex ruler. You can trim those tips off later. If your pieces were die cut, match up the blunted edges on both pieces. Here's what that looks like when sewing them together. Sew with a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way to the end. Continue chain piecing by sewing the entire stack of background side triangles to one side of the center triangles. This will speed up the entire process. This part is very relaxing and meditative for me, so I'll usually listen to an audiobook or quilting podcast while I sew. When the entire stack of units is sewn, grab a piece of scrap fabric called an ender to finish your sewing session. Now it's time to clip all the threads in between each of the units in the chain. I'm using a triangle thread cutter, which greatly speeds up this process. I put all of the sewn units into a pile as I clip them apart. The key to a nice flat quilt that's easy to put under the sheen for machine quilting is having nice flat blocks. To get super smooth flat blocks, I like to press all of my seams open. You heard that right, I press all of my seams open and I don't have any issues. Contrary to popular myth, this will not weaken your seams and you can still stitch in the ditch. Just remember, all of the methods and techniques I'm showing are what works according to me. If you have tried and true techniques that you like to stick with, that's perfectly fine, but maybe you'll be open to trying something new. After all, there's no quilt police here. I'm using a hot, dry iron with no steam. First, I use my finger to separate the seam, then press it open from the back side of the block. Then I flip the block over and press it again from the front. Press each and every seam for nice flat blocks. This really doesn't take me any longer than pressing seams to one side, and I find that my block sizes are much more accurate because none of the excess fabric is getting folded in the seam. Keep going, opening those seams and pressing each one with a hot, dry iron. My fingers are not in the way, so they won't get burned. Use your fingernail to wiggle those seams open as needed. I don't ever starch my blocks. Instead, I starch the fabric first before I ever cut into it. Now that we've sewn the side triangles to one side of our center units, it's time to repeat the same exact process on the other side. Just remember, chain piece and press all of your seams for best results. Rotate the center triangle upside down so you are adding the other side triangle in the same manner as before. Flip the background unit on top of the colorful triangle and sew with an accurate 1/4 inch seam from end to end. Here's what that looks like. Remember, if you are sewing die-cut pieces, match up the blunted edges. If you are sewing together pieces that are rotary cut, the little triangle tips will extend a 1/4 inch beyond the blunt edge. Continue chain piecing until the entire stack is finished. Clip the threads in between with a thread cutter or small thread snips and stack up your pile to press. When pressing seams open, the light fabric is pressed to the light side and the dark fabric is pressed to the dark side. This prevents shadowing and it eliminates bulk at seam intersections. It also makes it easier to sew patchwork since you don't need to remember which way to press. I'm pressing from both the back side and the front, so my blocks are crisp and flat. You need 4 of each block to make each flower, so stack your piles into similar fabrics. Separate your piles into the colorful saturated blocks and the lighter offset blocks. Well, there you have it. All of my triangle in a square blocks are sewn, pressed, and ready to assemble into the quilt top. We'll pick that up next time. To get any of the supplies shown here to make my blooming Wallflowers quilt, make sure you visit me at shop.kristaquilts.com.